Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Procurement Currents Q4, a quarterly economic outlook. I'm your host, Julia McElroy. I have two quick housekeeping items. First, in a few days, you'll receive an email from NASPO that includes a survey as well as materials from today's presentation. Today's webinar is good for 1 hour of continuing education. To receive your certificate, please complete the survey in the upcoming email. Your feedback is valuable to us at NASPO, so thank you in advance. Second, our presenters would like today's webinar to be interactive, so please feel free to raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, Brian Lines and Jake Smith-Wick, with the Center of Procurement Excellence. CPE is a nonprofit organization that focuses on improving procurement practices through education, training, and certification. Today's topic is an overview of 2025, including tariff impacts and national and international developments. Jake, please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Julie, and good to see everybody else here. I know that some of you, I just saw several of you out in California, so welcome if you're joining us for the first time. I'll go ahead and bring up my slide deck here, and we will dive straight in here. So let me pull this up here. Give me 1 second. All right. So kind of the game plan for today here is that it was kind of the story last time we had talked, but since then the story's developed a little bit, is that we're going to go through how we collect some of our data with the current forecast because the last few months has been, I don't know if the right word, Brian, is interesting from a data analysis and collection standpoint. And so we're going to talk about that. But I have good news, folks. Brian and I come bearing good news is that we do have new data. So we're going to bring up to speed what that's going to look like. So Brian will do that, and then we'll talk about kind of where the future is going to go from there. So brief overview about what Procurement Currents is. What this is a live event that we do every quarter in partnership with NASPO, and it's really meant to summarize the latest trends, outcomes, interesting factoids as we kind of see them. Brian and I present all the time to a number of different groups, and we're always looking at articles and data. And so we thought that this would be a great opportunity to really highlight some of the things that we're seeing that might be of interest to procurement professionals everywhere. So if you're first time, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. If you have friends that should also see this, make sure to invite them next time, and then we'll go forward from there. So the first thing we're going to do is offer kind of a brief history lesson as to where things have kind of gone over the last couple months. Now, as we do this here, as Brian and I can talk about this, there's a couple things that are happening all at once. And the reason why this is relevant to our discussion is that we've not really seen this before. So what's going on? We have massive workforce shifts and demographic changes. Okay, that's a huge event. There's economic instability in some regards. We'll talk about that. That's kind of the focus of today. We have the advent of AI, and all these things here by themselves would be impactful, but the fact they're all basically happening right at the same time is interesting. So as we think about this, there's a few guiding principles as we understand what's going on. The first one is that we're navigating by the stars under cloudy skies. And anybody that knows who said that, that would be Jerome Powell, chair of the Fed. Okay. Second thing is that history never repeats itself, but it often does rhyme. That would be Mark Twain. I thought that was interesting. And finally, of course, is that as we do the best we can with all this data, is that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that, my friends, is Mike Tyson. Okay. Now, we have two sources of data that we're going to primarily pull from today, mostly some of the public data for today. We have publicly available data, which is your BLS, your CPI, PPIs, and things like that. And one thing we've done to supplement that are the procurement checkups that CP does. So we do this on about a quarterly basis. We had the most recent one was from November of last year. So there's been about 1,000 people or so that responded to that, and we're going to continue that. And at the end of the webinar today, I would ask you all to think about what are some other data points that are not going to be presented today that would be helpful to you in your positions. So as you're going through the webinar, if you could please make some mental notes about, it'd be nice if we could talk about this, or if we could have data about this, because one of the resources that we have as CPE is to be able to collect some of that data. So now I mentioned that publicly available data, and Brian and I, again, we do a lot of presentations. We rely on a lot of that data, and as we know, over the last few months, it's been hard to get access to that. And so, because of the federal shutdown, this is in October to November, the data is not posted. And when you go on the websites, there's all these different notices that, hey, by the way, you're trying to get this, but it's not going to be updated. So it's been very difficult in terms of a schedule here. What happens? So September CPI and PPI that got delayed by about 2 weeks. The October CPI and PPI, kabosh, not even provided at all. Totally canceled. And that is lost to the annals of history. Um, we have no data about that. November, that was delayed to December 18th. The employment data, this is jobs and things that are related to that. Look at that. November 20th, a month and a half approximately for what we're looking for. And of course, the October data was canceled altogether. Nothing with that. So the government opened back up and things were good to go. So we're happy about that. And everything's been cheery since. Everything's all good to go. But wait a second. What happened last couple of days? Federal shutdown. So this is going to have further delays about what's going forward. But besides that, I actually looked online this morning, is that the current shutdown, which the government has opened back up, or they're very close to opening back up. But what that's going to do is going to delay some of the December's job data. It's really about openings and turnover. That's likely to be delayed until February sometime. And so we're going to see further delays with that. So that's kind of where things are, is that we've had a number of delays and looking at this. So we've had to look to other third-party sources to look at some of this, which is always a good thing to do, but nonetheless, it's certainly been a challenge to look at some of that. So with that said here, we've got data now. Compared to November, we have a lot more data now. And so I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to walk through and give us the state of the union, as it were, in terms of data. So Brian, go ahead and take it away.
All right, let me get my share up here. Okay, so two things we are going to do as we dig into the data. I thought that this quarter for Procurement Currents, we could do a little crash course on some of the methodology of how this data is even collected by the government. In this case, we're going to focus on the data provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So that's the BLS here, as abbreviated on the slide. And I'm just going to focus on the cost type of data. So as Jake was talking about, CPI, PPI, so that's Consumer Price Index, Producer Price Index. I'll explain those a little bit further. So when I go through the methodology of how this stuff is collected and reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which will help paint the picture too of why the data has been a little bit wonky over this last quarter, since today's subject is looking back at Q4 of 2025 and then thinking about what is to come this year in 2026. So we'll do a little bit of methodology here, maybe on future sessions together. If this is valuable to you all, we can do this for some of the other data that's collected as well. And as Jake mentioned, we'll give you the update here on what the data is showing now that we've got a big drop of the data as of late last week is when it all actually flowed in, which I'll explain. And then we'll also talk about some supplemental data sources that might be valuable beyond some of the government provided data out there as well. So let's start with crash course on methodology here. Dry stuff, right? We're talking economic data collection, fun times. But we'll start with the Producer Price Index. I'm going to just read a few things out to you so you get a sense of how this is collected and what's included. So basically what happens is that for any given industry in the country, there are a bunch of suppliers or producers that are picked, and the government does a systematic sampling of them. Basically what they do is the government looks at any employer who's producing stuff and is logged in the unemployment insurance system. So if you're an employer in the country and you're required to pay into the unemployment insurance system federally, then that means the government knows who you are, and they can say, wow, here's the list of all the companies in the country that are producing things. And then smartly, they take that information and then use it to go ask those companies about prices for their various products. And that's basically where the Producer Price Index is coming from. Once a company or an establishment is picked to participate in the PPI survey, then they are first visited by a field economist, and that's somebody who is employed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so a federal employee, hence why we had some gaps in the data in the fall when the government was shut down. Well, then those field economists are not out there doing their job. But they go out to that company or that firm, and they get the voluntary cooperation by them, walk them through how it all works. Everything's confidential, so no pricing is shared, all that kind of stuff to make sure suppliers aren't worried about their internal pricing getting out. And then once cooperation is confirmed, then the field economist uses some fancy techniques. This is basically a fancy way of saying the economist looks at the menu of all items that that particular company produces, and the economist helps pick which of these items the government wants to receive monthly pricing data about. So we're not going to, the government's not going to every employer. They're selecting them for various industry sectors. And then of the employers who are selected, or these producers who are selected, the government doesn't ask for pricing on absolutely everything that that organization does. They select specific products that the government is most interested in or needs as part of their sample for reporting, is basically what happens. Okay, so continuing on. From that point forward, monthly data flow comes in from that establishment and whoever else has already been doing it as part of this program. And it's all submitted on a confidential website back to the federal government. There are more than 100,000 prices that are flowing into the federal government through the Bureau of Labor Statistics every single month. And that's from more than 25,000 different reporters, each reporter essentially being a company here in the US that's producing some good or service. If an establishment fails to report in that month, then they get called up by an economist. So as you can imagine, this may not be the number one top priority for every one of these establishments, right? They're running their businesses, they're meeting customer needs, they're making sure they meet payroll and paying their employees. And yes, also they have volunteered to submit data to the government, but you can imagine that that can fall through the cracks on any given month. So the BLS does have resources to follow up with companies who didn't report that month. And that's going to get into how the revisions work here in a moment. And usually a company reports for 7 to 8 years on average before either they are asked to drop off or things get reshuffled, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics is looking at it every single year. Hey, where are we short? Where do we need more inputs and things like that? So so far, so good. Companies all submit their prices. There's a whole bunch of them doing it for a whole bunch of items is the summary here. Now, what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does with that data is they put it together into a bunch of different price indices, right? So the government is not reporting out, hey, here's what Toys R Us says prices are for, Barbie dolls. They're not going to single out any individual producer or supplier or any individual product just from one source. They're looking for aggregating the data across a number of different suppliers, and they build it into various indices. So there's a whole bunch of these. You can combine things in different ways. Now, the timing of this is also interesting. So let's go through the monthly cadence here for data collection. Here's essentially what happens if you map it out on a calendar. In general, suppliers are asked to report their prices on the Tuesday of whatever week of the month contains the 13th. So it's usually going to work out to about week 2 of any given month on average. Now, the government then takes that information in, and when the BLS will release that to us, the public, on their website is usually around the second week of the following month. So that's why there's a month lag in a lot of this data. And sometimes you'll hear economists saying this is a rear view mirror look. And in some senses, that's true. But it also makes sense when you think about there's 25,000 potentially suppliers reporting things in week 2 of one month. That's got to get taken in, double checked, make some phone calls if a supplier didn't submit things, and then add it all up into the various indices and get it produced into a nice looking report to then get released on the BLS website the next month. So basically the government's doing all that work through the BLS every single month on this rolling schedule. That's generally what happens. Now, the other thing that occurs is revisions. So acknowledging that not every supplier is going to respond promptly every single month, even if you call them. I'm sure none of us in procurement have any experience with non-responsive suppliers and trying to get a hold of them and get things done, right? That never occurs, of course, but well, yes, it does. And so as more data flows in, maybe it's late by a month or something like that, the government continues to update or revise the data as it comes in. So for example, let's say it's the second week of some given month where the initial reporting of prices comes in, and then that gets released the next month. So the BLS will release that the next month. And then if any more data comes in, they might do a revision the following month. And they'll do this up to 4 months. So they'll just keep revising as more data comes in and trickles in and they can get it added in. So this is all this trailing work happening while the ongoing work of every new month is still happening as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, to give you an example of the latest data release that we're going to cover here in a moment is we're here sitting in February, and we're not to the second or third week yet when the data is going to be released. So we're still dealing with January data. Now, January data is really reporting from December. So here's what happens. In December 2025, in that second week, where the 13th of the month of December was included, that's when the suppliers were all reporting their prices. And then because of that government shutdown, here I'll mention a couple other things, there were some delays. So as Jake mentions, from October 1st to November 12th, there was a shutdown. So this is interesting because we failed 14 times to reopen. This was actually the longest government shutdown in history, so it affected a lot of the data flows here. And so what happened is in December of 2025, we were back open again. Suppliers reported their prices, but we didn't get them released to us in the general public until the very end of January. It was actually last Thursday on January 30th because the government was using December, and I can say the government, BLS, the employees and economists of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they were using November and December to get caught up on the data that they did not collect or did not analyze from October and November during that long shutdown. So they weren't allowed to be in working and aggregating all that data. Well, suppliers could still be reporting it. So you're going to see in a moment that PPI, there's no break in producer price index. I'm going to get to consumer price index in a moment, and Jake is right. We lost an entire month because there were no economists walking around to grocery stores and other places collecting those prices because they were shut down for a month and a half. So that's what's happening here. So we got this delayed release now, just because of all of that activity happening back in the fall, or lack of activity might be a better way to say it. So that's been the big release here. So when I show you the data here in a moment, this is data from the fall of 2025, as late as middle of December, and we're just now getting it in late January into February is what's happening. So, okay. You can track the release schedules here, by the way, which is something that we do at Center for Procurement Excellence. So you can go on to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website here and I just always Google BLS release schedule, and you can see all the months on the side, and they give you their projected release date. So I went ahead and just picked, for example, October, and you can see that consumer price index comes out the second week of October on the 14th, and the 15th is when producer price index is expected to come out. Now, they're really good at hitting these dates. These dates are never missed unless there is some bigger thing going on, like a shutdown. But otherwise, if there's no shutdown happening, you can expect that on October 14th, we will get the CPI report. Usually comes out about 8:30-ish in the morning, Eastern time. And you'll get the PPI report around 8:30 in the morning on the 15th. And you can pretty much count on that. They don't really miss their deadlines. They're pretty good about that. Jake mentioned the employment reports too. Or the employment situation one getting delayed here with the shutdown just for this month. Okay. And before we get into the data, I'll hit CPI here momentarily as well, and then we'll move forward into what does the data say. Now, CPI, that's the consumer price index rather than producer price index. The CPI collects a whole bunch of stuff across all of these different categories, trying to track cost of living for the average American citizen. So food and beverage, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education, communication, and other goods and services. So a whole bunch of things with some of the examples listed out here on the slide for your viewing pleasure. All of this is what's coming in through CPI. Now, other things in here would be it's all indexed, so it's just showing you the percent change. Most things are indexed back to the early 80s right now. If they're not indexed back to that, sometimes it goes back to the 60s. And then anything that's a newer item, for example, the common example you hear from economists would be cell phones. Like that doesn't go back to the 60s or even to the 80s. So whenever they started tracking that at the BLS, that's when it's going to be indexed back to more recently. All right, so we're collecting a whole bunch of things as the government here for CPI, 100,000 things here as well. Now, 2/3 of that data collection is done by personal visits by field economists that are employed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they're literally walking into brick and mortar stores, so grocery stores, toy stores, apparel stores, and so on, going into all those retailers and looking at the shelf prices and then reporting that back. And they're doing that across various geographies and so on. This is a map of how the government breaks out the regions for your viewing pleasure here as well. And they collect fuel data in all 75 locations across the country that they're collecting it every single month. And then for all the other stuff that you get in the CPI, so, apparel and groceries and things like that, they pick the three largest geographic areas. So that's New York represents East Coast, Chicago here in the Midwest. I'm over in Kansas. I'm saying here like I'm in Chicago, but I'm not. And then West Coast, LA. So every single month, all of the pricing flows in from these three locations. And then for the other 72 locations, what's happening is the pricing comes in every other month. So just picture this, right? There's literal field economists employed by the BLS going out to stores, collecting prices, reporting it back in. So that's happening on. So okay, we're going to turn this into Raylene's question here. Sorry, I misread that on why this all matters, right? Because you want to track what's happening in pricing and trying to project things out here. And I'll point you into some other resources in a moment too. Okay. Now, briefly, a couple other comments of like, just because there's a solid methodology behind all of this doesn't necessarily mean that what's being reported is perfectly accurate and that you should take it to the bank and never question it. You need to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the methodology. So there's a few here just for CPI, so I'll cover them quickly. But substitution bias is what you'll hear most economists talking about, is that, for example, let's say that the average American household likes to buy, I don't know, a filet mignon steak, and then that price of steak goes up and they switch to chicken, then, well, if you're just measuring the price of filet mignon and that's gone up high, but that doesn't really reflect the cost to the household because they can switch products. And so that's one way where the BLS says they're probably overstating inflation. Quality changes are not perfectly accounted for. So like my cell phone that I have now is much better than the one I had back in high school with the old flip phone T9 texting. And pricing is a little more expensive now versus then. But how do you account for the fact that it's a much better product? And then they do update the basket over time, trying to keep up with changing preferences of American households. But they're going to be behind by about a year on that as well. So that might be a little out of date. Understating, probably the biggest one to me, well, these two big ones to me are when the field economists go out and track prices, they're just taking the sticker price. So they're not taking into account the out the door checkout price. So if you're shopping for deals and you're like, wow, like me, there are quite a few products pre-COVID that you could get much better deals on. 50% discounts were pretty common, and nowadays it's not so common. So if you just track the sticker price, yeah, it hasn't moved quite as much. But if you track the wallet or pocketbook impact by walking out the door with the deal, and there's not as many deals now, then we're understating what's going on here as well. Owner's equivalent rents. This happened back in the 80s where we stopped tracking the cost of new homes and we just did equivalent rent of those homes. So basically what the government is saying is if you want to go out and buy a home, that's not included. That price increase is not included in how they measure CPI anymore, which is very controversial. And energy is kept out of it, although they do keep energy in for a lot of the producer price items because they say that the producers are a larger user of energy than any average consumer. Plus, energy is really volatile. As you all know, watching gasoline prices jump up and down and so on, so forth. So the BLS themselves, for what it's worth, says they think they're overstating inflation by 0.5% per year. I might beg to differ on that, but it's hard to say, and maybe all this stuff roughly balances out, is the idea. Okay. Now, let's go through what the data says. This will get into a little bit more of why does this stuff matter? Again, being economically minded here in procurement and trying to predict bid prices, what's going to happen to budgets internally, and how it's going to affect our end users or internal agencies, and just being mindful of that, and also to help us be more informed as we enter negotiations with suppliers, all that good stuff. Probably the majority of you have seen cost escalation clauses changing in contracts over the last 4 or 5 years. of our much greater cost increases or inflation rates that we've seen. So suppliers have been insisting upon that. So it's another reason why you'd be tracking this stuff more closely. So here's the overall aggregate producer price index and consumer price index data, and I've benchmarked it back to spring of 2020, before all the fun began. And so basically what you're seeing here is a lot of the produced goods and products are up by more than 40%, benchmarked back to spring of 2020. And then as the government measures it, consumer price index, and this is going to be the typical household basket of goods. You can go look this up online, but it's going to include the owner's equivalent rent item we mentioned earlier. That's the proxy for housing. It'll include medical costs, education costs, transportation costs, groceries, other items, apparel, all bundled together with various weighting algorithms. And that's saying we're up by 25, 26%. This big drop off here was not because groceries went to become free in October. It's just because that's when the government was shut down, and that's when the field economists were not out there going to grocery stores and other commercial institutions tracking those prices. So that's just a zero is what's happening there. But I left it in the graph just so you could see it. A big issue for procurements and working with our suppliers and our internal agencies from a budgeting standpoint is a lot of us hear about the CPI in the news. That's the most common thing reported on any news agency that you look at, because they're talking to the average American household, which is a much bigger audience than us who are in procurement. But the producer price index is much more relevant to us and the type of pricing that we're getting back from our suppliers. And so when you see such a large disconnect, right, that it's not quite a doubling here, but pretty close, that the type of items that are being priced in by our suppliers and coming back to our agencies as quotes or bids that we're then getting negotiated into contracts might be close to 100% higher than what we're hearing about in the news. And so that in our experience at CPE and our broader work at Simplar is we're seeing a lot of budget busts and sticker shock going on our projects. And you're seeing a lot of client organizations think about these types of numbers and increases, whereas suppliers are thinking about the numbers up here in red. So you've got this automatic major disconnect about how we're mentally approaching pricing. All that's there. Yes, Raylan's a great point on pricing here too. There's unfortunately no free lunch for any of us on this, and we need our suppliers to be fairly profitable. I mean that in a sense of we want them to make a profit, but a fair profit that we've competed against. So anyway, let's break this out into more items just to get a sense of the different cost impacts and how widespread the changes have been. So again, I'm benchmarking this back to spring of 2020. I've got a whole bunch of different commodity items on here, including some transportation items. So this won't cover absolutely every type of project that you're procuring, and this is excluding wages. This is just material inputs for now. We can talk about wages in a moment. And the big takeaway that we've talked about on prior sessions is just the mountains and the valleys were all over the place, and a lot of things are up, 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 up. That's the big challenge. And so it's important to be able to disaggregate this into individual commodity prices, because depending upon what you are buying, you're seeing a major difference in pricing. So I've joked about this before, but in purple, this is lumber costs. I'm a genius because this is about the point in time when I tried to redo my back porch. So, I mean, that 120% increase is much different than, if I'm down here on buying some plastic piping and doing some irrigation work and putting in sprinklers at my house. That's not nearly the same delta at that particular point in time. So you have to disaggregate this and think about, for any upcoming project that you're helping to procure, if you are anticipating a budgetary tightness, you might want to help predict that or analyze that based upon what are some of the large items that are going to be included in this particular good or service that we are procuring. What type of materials are in there? Do we have a lot of steel in there, a lot of metal products in there, so on and so forth. Yeah, Jake, at one point I was trying to finish the roof on the porch and I needed one more piece of plywood, and I spent more than $50 on just a normal sheet of plywood. It was, I made a joke that like this better be gold, but no, it was just normal crummy plywood. But I needed it. I needed that one last piece, actually fraction of a piece, and that one really hurts. But needed to get done. Okay, enough of that. Now, if you pull out the percentages here, so I'll give you the percent changes here across the last nearly 6 years, going back to spring of 2020. Specifically, I benchmarked it back to February of 2020, right before everything hit in March. And you can see that we've got some major increases here, ranging from a third up to nearly 100% up on these items. So, very big differences here. Now, I just divided these numbers by 6 to get you a rough percentage change per year. Not quite right because this stuff is all compounding, but then again, it wasn't exactly 6 years, it's something a little less than that. So it's about right. And so if you look at that, you're seeing, for example, if you took the current pricing released as of end of 2025 in December for copper and brass mill shapes, that's a 15% increase average per year. And you go down the list, right? So if you see or hear the Fed, for example, talking about their goal as a 2% price increase per year, well, we're nowhere near that these last 6 years, just on some rough linear math here for a lot of the items that have gone into our suppliers' prices. I'm going to expand this analysis a little bit more. So I narrowed down to a few items that you can, the same things, but I deleted some so you can see more clearly. So a whole bunch of stuff on this spaghetti chart, and I just took out a few here. And what I kept is all the ones that in that last quarter, so fall of 2025, they seem to be going up. So let's talk about that here for a moment as well. So these are things that seem to be kind of hot on pricing, as they say economically. So prices going up more quickly. Let's take a look at those items. So if you just look at the percentage change from September before the government shutdown occurred all the way through the latest data in December, so roughly a 3-month time frame, so Q4 2025, here's the percent changes just in those 3 months across essentially the holiday season. And a lot of these are pretty high. And you might look at the bottom here and like, why'd you even keep asphalt paving? It's only 1%. That one didn't quite tick up there. But if you extrapolate this and say this is only 3 months, if you annualize it and you multiply it by 4 to try to get it to, well, if this same escalation continued for the next 12 months, what would that look like? And so I've just done some raw math there. This stuff becomes pretty hot. And even that 1%, it's really one and some decimal points there. That's a 5% annualized inflation or escalation rate going forward, which is well beyond the 2% targets that we're looking for. So we've got a lot of cost pressure that could be accelerating again. Well, it did accelerate throughout the holiday season. Let's see if that continues here in early 2026. But right now we're seeing larger increases for a greater number of items and products, materially speaking, going forward here. So something to monitor. And just underlining those, like all of these annualized rates, if they were to persist, are greater than the escalation that you saw in the last 6 years annualized. So I've underlined every number here for an item that would be a larger cost increase in the coming year than what actually occurred over the last 6, which we all know was a hot 6 years for cost increases. So hopefully that makes sense that we're seeing some acceleration in cost increases right now over the last 3 months of 2025. And those cost increases are accelerating at a rate that was faster than what we saw over the last 5 to 6 years, which was already some large cost increases. So we'll see. We'll see. April mentions, don't believe we're going to get down to 2% increase. I saw a hilarious analysis, not hilarious, hilarious in a sad way. So, sad. As I was preparing for this webinar, and there was someone who put together an analysis of all the Federal Reserve quotes, so both from Fed Chair Powell as well as the other members of the FOMC, so the committee there across the Fed. And it was just an analysis of every time reporters asked them, when do you think we're going to get back to 2% cost increase per year? And the answer was always 18 and 24 months, so a year and a half to 2 years out. And they started saying that back in 2021, and yet here we are. So I don't know. Maybe they think, I don't want to ascribe too much motivation to that. I don't know. The facts are that that's been the consistent answer for 5 years, and we haven't achieved it. Maybe that's why Jake had that quote of was it navigating by the stars under cloudy skies is what Fed Chair Powell said. That was like 4 years ago, I think. Okay, now what does this all mean for supplier bids and pricing? That's probably pretty obvious, but let's go take a few. And I'll show you my personal favorite to track from a procurement standpoint. And I think this is valuable to track even if you don't procure this specific type of good or service. And I'm going to focus on construction here first. Now, so here's why I think construction bids are a good measure generally for the economy as a whole, and it's a good proxy for a lot of things we buy. First is if you know the actual mixture of cost inputs to a construction bid, it's about 40% labor costs, it's about 40% material costs, and 20% other things, overhead profit contingencies. So it's a really good mix of raw material, people working, and other just business costs that are in there. And if you think about labor too, you get a wide range of labor types from skilled crafts to general laborers and so on. You get materials is coming from a range of suppliers throughout the supply chain. So I like all of that mixed in. And another thing that's really nice about tracking construction costs, if you think about it from a nerd methodology standpoint of like, well, how does the BLS and the government track this stuff and how trustworthy are the sources that they're getting the data from? Construction, in my opinion, is probably the most trustworthy data input from a bid perspective because just as their general day-to-day business, contractors are bidding on work all the time. So they have a high volume of bidding. They're connected to suppliers directly. They're getting quotes coming in from subs and suppliers all the time. They're highly geographically dispersed. And so, if you're asking a supplier group to tell you what their quotes are, you're not going to find a supplier group that does more bidding and quoting of items to a broader range of suppliers and subs than you are in construction. Like they're just the most connected. So I tend to trust this data the most when it comes to bidding data coming out of the BLS. Now, all right, let's take a look. You can go back and look at the tariff stuff. Here momentarily, but like just quickly, like the tariff stuff was hitting back in last summer and beyond. The fall stuff here is potentially different. So personally, I wouldn't say that tariffs are the big thing that you're seeing here. There's some other reasons I say that. None of this data is perfect at capturing the tariff effects. And we could go through I'm happy to stay after and do some kind of like mock math on it to see why it wasn't as big of an effect on these things. But Jake's going to talk about the CPE surveys that went out, and we surveyed last summer when things were starting and then into the fall again across hundreds of procurement professionals, and most said that, yeah, they saw some tariff impacts, but not a ton, maybe not not huge impacts, as Jake's saying there in the chat. Okay. Here's the bid prices across a number of different segments of construction, just to give you a sense of how suppliers are pricing this stuff in. This goes back to whoever earlier said the suppliers are not going to be pricing in a loss, of course, right? So looking at the last 6-ish years across a number of different construction types, you're seeing a third to a half increase on overall pricing. You annualize that, you're basically talking a 5 or 6% per year, all the way up to 8 or 9% per year increase rate in bid prices. Oh, that's not exactly what happened, right? It wasn't that like it was static 8% per year. You have this huge jump and then a moderate increase, and then you're seeing these little jump ups here recently that we're going to be monitoring very closely, and we'll be excited to report back to you here the next time we get together for Procurement Currents. So, the percent change of the last 3 months, just what we saw in the last, Q4 of 2025, some pretty big increases if you annualize those out. Again, bid prices are accelerating over the last 3 months at a faster rate than what we saw for the average of the last 6. So again, another potential warning sign for your internal client groups with their budgeting processes is at least for the last 3 months of October, November, December of 2025, bid prices coming back from suppliers started to ramp up again at a faster rate than what they'd been doing over the last couple of years at least. Really going back probably to 2022 after this big ramp up. Whereas this is the last 3 months was the fastest increase in bid prices going back about 4 years now. Okay, so you can, I tried to map that out for you. Got ahead of myself. Wrapping it all the way up, if you just track PPI as a procurement professional and you look at it against just bid prices from suppliers, it's a pretty good measure. because supplier bids generally track the inputs on goods that they're seeing here. There's a little bit of a lag, as you can see, the red line moving first in time. But whoever it was earlier who said that the suppliers cannot operate at a loss on the prices they're paying for materials, that gets priced in eventually. And you can see how they've been tracking one another here pretty closely. So if all you do is monitor PPI from a goods perspective, that gives you a general sense on what you could expect in bid prices. Now, if you are monitoring that, and I'll pull this back up here. So you go to BLS, the last release, as I mentioned, on January 30th, they've got PPI in there, and they give you the headline numbers. And most of the hardcore economists and folks that I watch will tell you be careful with the headline numbers. But one thing I like to do here is you're like, oh, PPI for advances by 0.5% in December. That doesn't sound so scary, but then you pull up the handy dandy calculator, you go 0.5 times 12 to see, well, what would that mean for an annual rate here? Oof, like that's a high rate there, 6% rate a year. So got to watch out for that. See 0.7, even scarier. And you're talking 8% across the year. Now, that's not perfectly accurate, right? There's no guarantee that that same rate is going to continue for the next year. But sometimes you see these fractions get released in a month, and our brain interprets fractions as, fractions are small, doesn't scare me. But this is actually another hot month of cost increases, is what's going on. Okay. Other economic data, and then I'll pass it over to you, Jake, here to show how we're trying to supplement this stuff. So big view here. Why does this matter, right? This stuff matters to us in procurement because we are seeing prices coming back from a wide range of suppliers across all different industries with different mixtures of cost inputs. And we do live in uncertain times when it comes to pricing. I didn't even touch on labor and all of that stuff too today. But first, on the publicly available data, the government provided data sources that we have here in the US at least is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS. They've been in the spotlight here in today's session. We talked a lot about costs, but they also track employment, they track wages, they track spending. So what that means to us in procurement is how many people are working in a given segment of the industry has something to do with supply and demand. How much are clients spending on different types of goods, services, and products? That has to do with supply and demand, which will affect bid prices. And wages as well. That's the other thing that goes into your cost increases. Is not just the material prices I was looking at today, but also wages. So in future procurement current sessions, maybe we'll go into some of the methodology around these items too, and provide you more of an update there. And the other big one that we track is the U.S. Census Bureau's population updates too. That goes hand in hand with a lot of the employment releases that come out monthly as well. So that's probably the most commonly tracked and most useful government provided data that we look at, and a lot of other folks look at too. You go to industry provided data, procurement, NASPO's got a lot of market research resources available. So for example, if I click over, you can go to their market research page here, and they do put out with Procurement IQ some commodity items, that's probably the most closely related to what we covered here today. It's just different commodities and what the pricing trends look like. So you can go get those through NASPO. I do put ISM on there just because you'll hear about PMI in the news. It's the Purchasing Managers Index. You hear that mainly for manufacturing, so that's usually private sector, maybe less relevant to a NASPO audience. And services as well. But you do hear about that in the news often enough, so I mentioned that there. Construction, there's a couple surveys that go out from AGC and ENR. Facilities management, Jake is personally heavily involved in some of the FM Pulse stuff that goes out through IFMA. And IT, we've really not found something that's that great. So we've got a few that come out annually, but mostly they just track the BLS data themselves and report that out. So it's actually nothing new. So you have to parse that out too. What I was trying to show you here is data that is different than what the government already releases. If you go into a lot of the government a lot of these same groups, they also have their own economists that report out on the BLS data, but I'm looking for where are they getting different sources, which then cues us up for Jake to take over here to say, there are some blind spots for those of us in procurement when you just rely upon government provided data and other outlets. and that's something that we're trying to fill in here is via the procurement checkup. What can we crowdsource from all of you? And we'll do the work on the CPE side to send it out and to aggregate it. But what can we crowdsource together? Because all of you are seeing pricing coming in, you're negotiating contracts, you're seeing a wide variety of things all over the US and beyond. What can we be asking and checking on that's not already covered in the other publicly available data? So, Jake, pass it over to you to discuss that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brian. And one other thing I want to hit with this too is that we're really trying to build almost like a community, right? A community of like-minded procurement professionals that need data that maybe that publicly available data doesn't really have for us. So again, we're almost pleading with you. If you have ideas, if you have things that you need, let us know because we have a very strong interest in collecting some of that. So what CP primarily does is we collect this procurement checkup data. It changes on a quarterly basis for what we're looking at here. And the primary things that we're trying to collect are work. Brian's laughing because my head's in the way. So, anyways, we collect workforce, market conditions, technology, and procurement. So, workforce, we have data about typical FTE counts for procurement. So, how many staff folks are available, job satisfaction, stress levels. These are some of the main things we track with that. We also look at market conditions. So, in terms of number of bids that are coming in, the responsiveness, project performance, things like that. Technology, what we've really looked at here recently has been more about the impact of AI on procurement. Are you all using it? Are there policies around that? And we're just trying to see where things are going towards the future. Quick sidebar on the AI thing is that Brian and I think that AI is going to have significant impact on procurement in terms of what we do. But we're just trying to measure where that's going. And then finally, is just flat out the day-to-day work of procurement operations, number of transactions, budgets, training, things like that. And this is we have data about all this here, and we try to update key pieces of this on a regular type basis. Now, when you think about new data, and Brian and I we chatted, I think it was maybe a week or so. So we're thinking about what is this new data set going to look like. We have a couple new areas we're thinking about collecting some data on for what we're going to do. What are the quality of scopes looking like from you all? Are they getting better or worse? Are your end users providing more proactive? Are they coming to the page to the table that with a lot better insights or not so much? We work with a group. This is about 2 months ago, and they gave us recent copies of their scopes. Folks, I'm not surprised, but it was literally two sentences about it was like a $6 million project where where they're starting at here, right? So we want to get some like, is that just a one-off case, or broadly speaking, what are we seeing from your end users from scope of work development? How about budget changes in terms of different types of procurements? Are you seeing more budgets? I know somebody in the chat mentioned that they've recently readjusted their thresholds, but broadly speaking, and what are agencies doing from a budget allocation standpoint? In terms of cycle times, are you able to push these out faster or slower, about the same? And what's some enabling factors that have certainly affected that? And then maybe overall proposal quality. I know that Brian and I have seen an increase in overall quality. Let me clarify that. We've seen better written words, English on paper proposals, but I don't know if the quality has actually been. There's a lot more fluff, I would say sometimes, but we're just trying to get y'all's opinion without poisoning the well here about what you've seen in terms of overall impact of what we're seeing with that. So we're looking to have upcoming reports. So like the tariff impacts, we've got some data about that, which has been relatively muted so far. Change in the market, workforce trends, use of AI. So these are the types of things that we're looking to develop. Certainly free, available to anybody, but that's kind of the idea with that. So we have some time left here, and one thing that Brian and I wanted to, just maybe have a conversation for a minute for anybody that if you have ideas or types of data they would like to see, use the chat box, unmute yourself here, but let's just take a minute. If anybody has specific types of data they would like to see produced that's procurement specific, now would be a great time to chime in here and give us some thoughts about what that is.
Yeah, and
Brian,
again, I think
go
I'm just going to say the opportunity is, we have 125 some odd folks, procurement professionals online today, and many more on the CPE and NASPO mailing lists. And so the idea would be if we send out a short survey roughly every quarter, we'll probably do that the month or two ahead of the next webinar that we do here on Procurement Currents so that we can get all your feedback, and then we will do the work to average it all up and aggregate it and analyze it, and then we'll release all of that here and walk through it and talk about it on these Procurement Current webcasts so that if you participate or maybe you forgot that quarter, we're still getting that inflow from hundreds of procurement professionals across the US and beyond, and just getting the all of our brains combined are smarter than any individual one of us, right? And we can break it out by regions and so on and so forth if we get enough participation. So if you have other ideas, yeah, we'll definitely want to hear your inputs here. But as Jake mentioned, we already have questions for: are you seeing more or less competition in, say, IT RFPs? Are you seeing more or less competition from your suppliers in the facilities space and the business services? So we've got those types of questions that are not tracked anywhere else to our knowledge. So it'd be valuable for us to get your feedback on that. Like, are you seeing more or less competition, more or fewer bids, things like that? In various market segments. We'll also ask workforce questions on staffing levels here from a procurement standpoint every year or so. But yeah, what else on a quarterly basis would be valuable for you all to see?
Well, while folks are thinking about that, I want to make sure we do get our announcements out, but take a minute to think about some of that. We do have some upcoming classes with NASPO. We just finished up last week our Better RFPs, Better Projects class. We had about 50 folks in that one. We'll have another one in August. We have our deep dive for effective evaluations in February and September. So in fact, Brian, I think that starts next week, right? Or one of them starts next week. So we got more classes coming. Those are available for sign up on Procurement U. We'll have another series of dates. We need to figure out what those new dates are going to be, but we'll have another occurrence coming up. Procurement checkups. We also have a monthly web series called Ask the RFP Doctor. In fact, the link for that is in the chat box. So if you want to join us for that, we'd love to have you there. And we have a variety of different topics we talk about every month on that RFP Doctor event. So you go to the website, sign up for us. We have recordings. Next week, or whenever that is, we'll talk about the known unknowns. We'll also talk about alternate delivery in March. So that's the topic for there. And then some other supply chain impacts coming up in at the end of the month. But folks, thanks for your time here. We really appreciate it. And we do have a few minutes left. So if you have any other ideas or perspectives, suggestions, data that would make your life easier with the boss or whoever, we certainly would love to hear the impacts about that.
So Jake and Brian, thanks. That was awesome as always. Since we have a few minutes, would you expand a little bit on your comment about AI and the significant impact that it's going to have on procurement? I think that our participants would be interested in hearing about that.
Well, absolutely. And folks, we're just trying to play it straight here. And so let me offer kind of what we're thinking about that is that I think you all have seen that the vendors' proposals, in fact, we've heard this from numerous different agencies, are all looking about the same. So we know that there's AI being used to write these proposals here. In fact, I was at an event a few months ago. It's like an open shop or an open forum about this. And this idea started percolating in the audience like, well, we should write in our RFPs no more AI use in your proposals. And I couldn't contain myself. We still say, guys, this is a terrible idea because you're never going to be able to regulate it and you're going to get yourself protested. So regardless, we're seeing more AI content in proposals. We're also seeing more scopes of work in RFPs being written by AI. And it's not a further step to think about, can AI also evaluate the actual proposals that come in? So when you put all that together, the fact that AI is affecting all these major functions about what we do in procurement, we find ourselves having a very different job going forward in terms of what that looks like. Final comment about that is that going forward, I think that procurement, Brandon, I think that procurement going forward are going to be the purveyors of trust inside of the organization. That as we have less and less confidence in our abilities to do things, for our vendors to be able to do what they say can do in terms of schedules and budgets and things like that. And in the proposals that are being written, we don't know if that's true or not. Procurement is on the front line of identifying that, yes, we can trust this firm, and here's how we know to do that. I mean, we can just phrase that. We think in the future, trust is almost going to be a transactable value, almost like a currency. that the more we can trust somebody, the more we're willing to work with somebody because of that. So our thoughts on that, Julia. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the group? There was a question about the presentation. We will share that for sure. Anything else, Brian and Jake?
No, I don't think so. There's a lot more data we could always talk about. I just prepare now. I get ready to go. Things are changing, but we are excited. I know there's some headwinds, things we are concerned about, but I think the net benefit, and I don't know Brian's thought here, but I think the net benefit long run is that things are going to be stellar. There's going to be a lot of incredible advancements we're going to see over the next several years. And yeah, it's we're in a rough patch, I think, a little bit. We're approaching that, but I am very, very excited about where the future is going to go. But Brian, thoughts from you?
No, just would love any feedback of data or any information that you all wish you had at your fingertips that could be reasonably collected from a few hundred procurement professionals chiming in every quarter. We're happy to help facilitate that and continue reporting it out here.
Great, thanks. So on behalf of NASPO, I want to thank Brian and Jake from the Center of Procurement Excellence for the valuable information that they've shared and for working with NASPO to bring it to you. As mentioned, you'll receive a follow-up email containing today's slides. This webinar qualifies as 1 hour for your continuing education credits. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be available on the NASPO YouTube page, so please share it with your colleagues. Lastly, this month, we have 3 outstanding Cronin webinars, February 12th, 19th, and 26th. The registration link is in the chat. On March 25th, NASPO is hosting a new webinar on market research. The link will be available soon. And remember to check out the latest episodes of the Pulse podcast. You can find them at naspo.org. Thanks again for attending today's webinar and have a great day.